April 1887. The door was small. Just planks of pine set into a grassy mound low enough that a grown woman had to duck to reach the handle. Nothing about it looked like much. Edith Voss stood in front of it. Her hand rested on the wooden latch. Not pulling, not pushing, just resting there the way you rest your hand on a Bible before you speak a truth you can't take back. 6 months. 6 months since she had closed this door and walked away. 6 months since she had placed everything she had left in the world: 6 wheels of cheese, 1 winter's worth of faith, and the voice of a dead man into the cold dark behind it. The whole of Caldwell Hollow had said she was foolish. Harlan Pruitt had said she was digging her own grave. And Owen, her brother, 12 years old, the only person left on this earth who shared her blood, had started to believe them. Maybe they were right. She was about to find out. Edith pulled the door open. The air that came out was not the dead, sour smell of failure. It was cool and clean and deep, the smell of cold stone and damp earth, and something else underneath. Something sharp. Something alive. She knew that smell. Her father had described it once a long time ago beside a creek in the late afternoon sun. That he had said his time doing its work. She hadn't understood him then. She did now. April had not yet forgiven Colorado for the winter it had just endured. The grass was coming back. Slowly. In patches. The way hope comes back after a long grief, not all at once. Not with any particular fanfare, but in small, quiet places where the frost had finally let go. Edith Voss was 22 years old. She did not feel 22. She felt like someone who had been carrying a very heavy stone for a very long time, and had only recently begun to suspect that the stone was the point. She stood at the edge of what had once been a field. A real field. Someone's field. The furrows were still there if you knew how to look, faint impressions in the earth. The ghost of rows that someone had once planted with intention and hope. The sage had taken most of it back. The pines were working on the rest. In another 10 years there would be nothing left to suggest that any human hand had ever touched this ground. But the hand had been there. Edith could feel it. That was something her father had given her. Not money. Not land. Not a name with any weight in Caldwell Hollow. Just the ability to look at a piece of ground and understand that it had a memory. That the earth kept things. That if you paid attention, really paid attention with your hands and your feet and something quieter than your mind, the land would tell you what it had seen. Her father had been a great believer in paying attention. He was gone now. Her mother, too. Both of them taken inside of a single week by the fever that had swept through Caldwell Hollow the previous September, moving from house to house like something with a purpose. Something that knew exactly what it was doing and did not apologize for it. Edith had nursed them both. She had boiled the water and changed the linens and sat through the nights holding first one hand and then the other. She had done everything the fever allowed a person to do, which was not enough. It was never enough. That was the particular cruelty of fever. It let you feel useful right up until the moment it proved you were not. Owen had been 12 years old when they buried their father. He was still 12 when they buried their mother 4 days later. He had not cried at either burial. Not because he didn't feel it. Edith knew he felt it. She could see it in the way he moved afterward carefully, as if the grief were something breakable that he was carrying inside his chest and was afraid of dropping. He was a serious child. He had become a more serious child. Edith had held him at night and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not sound like a lie. And then Silas Drummond had come to the house. He came 3 days after the second burial, which was, Edith would later think, the exact number of days he had calculated it would take for the shock to make a person pliable. Not so many days that they had regained their footing. Not so few that it looked indecent. Silas Drummond was the town secretary of Caldwell Hollow. He was a tall man, thin in the way that suggested efficiency rather than hardship. He wore his coat well. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read, not because it was complex, but because it had been deliberately simplified. All the soft edges removed, all the uncertainty filed away until what remained was a surface that reflected nothing back. He came alone. He carried papers. Miss Voss, he said at the door, his hat in his hand, his voice arranged into something that resembled sympathy. I am deeply sorry for your loss. Both losses. Your parents were... He paused. Selected a word. Known. Edith said nothing. I'm afraid there is the matter of the property taxes, he said. It appears your father had fallen behind. Significantly behind. I've brought the documentation. He handed her the papers. She looked at them. She was not an educated woman in the formal sense. She had not been to school beyond what the local church had provided, but her father had taught her to read carefully, to read what the words said and also what they did not say, to notice the spaces between sentences, the way you notice the spaces between stones in a wall, because those spaces told you how the thing had been built. These papers had been built carefully. Too carefully. The numbers were neat. The dates were precise. The official seals were exactly where official seals were supposed to be. Everything about the documentation was correct in a way that made Edith's skin go cold. Because real things, real records, real debts, real transactions made by real people over real years were never this clean. They accumulated corrections, crossings out, margins full of second thoughts. These pages had no second thoughts. Someone had thought of everything before they wrote the first word. I need time to review this, Edith said. Of course, said Drummond. You have until Friday. It was Tuesday. He put his hat back on, nodded with the practiced gravity of a man who delivers difficult news for a living, and has long since stopped feeling it, and walked back down the path to where his horse was waiting. Edith stood in the doorway until he was gone. Then she went inside and sat down at her father's table and looked at the papers for a long time. Her father's ledger was on the shelf above the fireplace. She got it down. She went through every entry, every date, every transaction her father had recorded in his small, careful hand. There was no debt. Not $1 of it. She looked for the ledger again the next morning because she wanted to look again, to be certain. It was gone. She searched the entire cabin, twice. The ledger was not in the house. It was not in the barn. It was not anywhere she could think to look. It had been there Tuesday morning. By Wednesday it was gone. Friday came, and with it the understanding that Caldwell Hollow had decided what it wanted, and had arranged the paperwork to match. There was a family 2 streets over the Becketts who had offered to take Owen. Just Owen. He could sleep in the back room and help with the animals, and in a few years maybe learn a trade. It was a decent offer. It was the kind of offer you made when you were genuinely trying to help and genuinely could not conceive of a world in which a 22-year-old girl with no money, no land, and no husband might have a plan that did not involve accepting charity from someone else. Edith thanked the Becketts. She declined. Owen looked at her when they left. Where are we going? He asked. There's a place, she said. Father mentioned it once, an old homestead, out past the mill road where the pines come down to the foothills. That place is abandoned. Yes, Owen thought about this. He was 12. He was practical in the way that children who have lost something enormous sometimes become, not because practicality comforts them, but because it gives them something to do with their hands. Is there a cabin? There's something, so, Edith said. We'll see what it is when we get there. They left that afternoon. They did not look back. Not because looking back would have been weak, but because there was nothing behind them worth turning around for. The road to the old homestead was not a road anymore. It was a suggestion, a rumor of a road. The kind of path that exists in the memory of the land even after the people who made it are gone, visible only in the way the grass grew differently, the way the pines stood slightly farther apart in a line that was just too straight to be accidental. Edith followed it. Owen walked beside her, carrying the bundle that held everything they owned between them. He did not complain. He had learned in the past weeks that complaints were a kind of expenditure, and they could not afford expenditures. The homestead appeared in the late afternoon. It was worse than she had imagined. The cabin listed to the east as if it had been leaning against the wind for so long that the wind had simply given up and left. And now the cabin didn't know how to stand straight anymore. The roof had held but barely. The door hung from one hinge. The window on the south side had given up entirely and was now just a hole. The cold come through it with complete indifference. The well was choked. Leaves and debris and years of neglect had reduced it to a dark mouth full of bad water. Owen set the bundle down. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Edith. He did not say what he was thinking. But she knew what he was thinking because she had been thinking it too. She just had the advantage of having thought it earlier privately and having arrived on the other side of it. "Let's see what we have," she said. What they had was very little. But it was something. The cabin walls were sound beneath the lean. The floor was dirt but compacted and dry. The fireplace was intact. The chimney drew clean. Owen discovered this last fact by building a small fire inside while Edith cleared the debris from the doorway. And when the smoke went up and did not come back down, they looked at each other with something that was not quite relief but was in the same neighborhood. It was Edith. It was Edith who found the hump behind the cabin. She almost walked past it. It looked like a collapsed section of ground, a rectangular depression about 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. Its edges softened by years of frost and thaw and frost again, the center sunken deep where the supports had given way. Rotted timbers jutted from the earth at odd angles. Dried grass had woven itself through the wreckage, but she recognized the shape. She stopped. She stood very still, and she heard her father's voice in her head as clearly as if he were standing 2 feet behind her. "A root cellar is just a hole," he had said. "Anyone can dig a hole. The question is what you do with the walls." She crouched down at the edge of the depression and looked at what remained of the walls. Stone. Not properly laid stone. Not chosen stone. Whoever had built this had used whatever was closest mismatched field stones, a few pieces of creek rock, nothing selected for the purpose. The mortar had crumbled. The walls had folded inward under the weight of the earth above them. It was by any reasonable measure a ruin. But the depth was right. And the location was right, set into the north slope behind the cabin, sheltered by the pines, out of direct summer sun. Someone had understood something. They just hadn't understood enough. Edith sat back on her heels and thought about her father. He had been a mason. A real one. Not the kind of man who built things to last a season or a decade, but the kind who thought in terms of what would still be standing when his great-grandchildren were old. He had come from the east, from Pennsylvania, from a family that had come before that from the mountains of Central Europe, from a place where stone was not just a building materials but a language, a way of knowing the world. He had taught her that language, not in a classroom, not with books, but in the way that real knowledge gets passed sideways through the hands in the middle of something else entirely. She remembered being 8 years old, sitting beside him at a creek not so different from the one that ran along the bottom of this valley. He had been looking for stone. Not just any stone. He picked up a piece of granite, dense gray smooth from years in the current, and placed it in her small hands. "Feel the weight of it," he said. She felt it. "Now close your eyes." She closed them. That stone was in cold water for a long time. It remembers the cold. Put it in a room and it will keep the memory of that cold for hours, days, even if you give it enough mass. That's why we use creek granite for the floor. The floor is where the cold lives. He had taken the granite back and handed her something else. Flatter, lighter, a dull reddish gray. "This one is schist. Run your thumb along the surface." She did. It felt different. Almost powdery. Like it had a skin. "Schist breathes," her father said. "It takes moisture from the air when the air is dry and releases it when the air is heavy. Put schist in your upper walls and your cellar will never dry out completely. It will never flood either. The stone will find the balance." He had smiled at her then. People think a good cellar is just a deep hole with a door. It isn't. A good cellar is a conversation between the stone and the earth and the air. Your job as a builder is just to set up the conditions so the conversation can happen. Then you get out of the way. Edith sat in the ruins of Thomas Marin's collapsed cellar and thought about that conversation. She had not thought about it in years. And then Owen's voice reached her from inside the ruins. "There's something down here." He had climbed part way into the depression, picking through the fallen timbers with the careless confidence of a 12-year-old who had not yet developed a thorough respect for unstable structures. He was crouching now, pulling something free from beneath a section of collapsed wall. It was heavy. He needed both hands. He climbed back out and held it up. It was a wheel of cheese. Or it had been once. What it was now was something closer to stone. The rind had gone dark, almost black, and the interior had dried to the hardness of old wood. It was completely desiccated. Whatever moisture had once given it life had long since departed. It was a small, dense, dead thing. Edith took it from him. She turned it over. On the flat bottom, scratched into what had once been soft rind, and was now as hard as carved wood, were 4 letters and a year. T. Marin, 1871. She stood there for a moment, holding the dead thing that someone had made with care and stored with hope 15 years before she was standing here. Thomas Marin, probably the man who had built this cabin, who had looked at this same slope, this same north-facing depression, and had seen what she saw: potential, a possibility, something worth trying. And it had failed. She looked at the collapsed walls, at the mismatched stone, at the inadequate depth and the poor drainage, and all the ways the cellar had betrayed the person who built it. It hadn't failed because the idea was wrong. It had failed because the execution was wrong. These were not the same thing. She carried the dead wheel of cheese inside the cabin and set it on the highest shelf. Owen looked at it, then at her. "Why are you keeping it?" "Because," she said, "it tells me exactly what not to do." He thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded. Owen was like that. He could follow a certain kind of logic even when he didn't fully understand it yet. It was 3 days later that Harlan Pruitt came. He came with his wife, Mabel. They came in a wagon, which was the respectable way to visit in Caldwell Hollow, and Mabel had a basket in her lap that smelled of bread and dried fruit, which was the respectable thing to bring when visiting the unfortunate. Harlan Pruitt was a big man. Not tall exactly, but wide through the shoulders, wide through the opinion. He had farmed the same 200 acres for 30 years, and the land had shaped him the way land always shapes the people who work it long enough until you couldn't quite tell where one ended and the other began. He had a reputation in Caldwell Hollow as a man who knew things, practical things, the real kind. He stood beside Edith and looked at the depression behind the cabin. She had already begun to clear it. 3 days of work pulling the rotted timbers free, removing the worst of the collapsed material, beginning to understand the dimensions of what she was working with. "Root cellar," Harlan said. "Yes." "Old Marin's. He couldn't make it work." He squinted at the hole. "What are you planning to do with it?" "Rebuild it, she said. "Properly." He looked at her with the patient, slightly sorrowful expression of a man who has watched a great many people attempt things that wouldn't work. "For what purpose?" "Cheese," Edith said. "Aged cheese. I need a space where the temperature stays constant, where the humidity stays controlled. Stone does both if you choose the right stone and lay it right." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Ara," he said, then caught himself. "Miss Voss. Cheese is made in spring and eaten by summer. That's how it works." "Some cheese," she said. "Not this kind." "And where did you come by this knowledge, my father?" He nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man filing information in a place he would not look at again. "The stone will hold cool, maybe, but it won't hold damp the way you're describing. Stone is dry." "Some stone is dry," Edith said. "Some stone breathes. It depends entirely on what kind you use and where you put it." Harlan looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the bony brown cow standing in the makeshift pen Owen had built at the side of the cabin. "That cow's not going to give you enough milk to make cheese worth aging," he said. "She'll give more as spring comes and the grass comes in." He took a slow breath. "Miss Voss," he said, and his voice had shifted into something that was genuinely kind, which made it harder to hear. "You and the boy should come to town for winter. The Becketts are still willing to take Owen. Mrs. Crandall has a room. No one would think less of you." "I know," Edith said. "Then let us help." "You are helping," she said, "by being honest with me. I appreciate it." She looked at him directly. "I'm going to stay." He studied her face. He found something there that he wasn't entirely sure what to do with. It wasn't stubbornness exactly. Stubbornness was familiar. He knew how to handle stubbornness. This was something else. He put his hat back on and went to find his wife. Mabel Pruitt had not been standing where Edith expected her to be. She had expected Mabel to be by the wagon the way women often stood by wagons in these situations, slightly apart from the practical assessment of things, waiting to offer the bread when the conversation was done. But Mabel was standing at the edge of the collapsed cellar, looking into it. She had not brought the basket. She had set it on the wagon seat and walked around the cabin on her own, and was standing at the edge of the hole with her hands clasped in front of her, and an expression on her face that Edith could not quite name at first. It wasn't pity. That was the first thing Edith registered. It wasn't the look of a woman surveying someone else's difficulty from a safe distance. It was something more interior than that. More personal. "My mother made cheese," Mabel said without turning around. "Good cheese. I never learned how." Edith waited. Harlan never saw the need for it. Mabel was quiet for a moment. "He's not a cruel man. I want you to understand that. She paused. "He knows what works, and he has never been wrong enough times to make him curious about what else might." She turned then and looked at Edith. "Where did you learn about the stone?" she asked. It was the simplest question Edith had been asked since arriving at the homestead. And somehow, it was the one that made something open in her chest. "My father," she said again. But this time it came out differently, not as a credential, as a grief. Mabel looked at her. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man." He was. They stood there, the two of them, on either side of the collapsed cellar. The afternoon light was going golden in the pines. The wind had settled. "How long will it take," Mabel asked, "to build it right?" "The rest of spring," Edith said. "Into summer, probably. And then winter, and then we'll see." Mabel nodded. She looked at the hole once more, and then she said the most honest thing anyone had said to Edith since her father died. "My husband would never have allowed me to try something like this," she said. Not bitter, not resentful, just the plain statement of a plain truth about the life she had lived. Edith did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing. And that was all right. It was Willa Ashby who came 3 days after the Pruitts, and she did not come with bread. She was a quiet woman, 45 maybe. She had lost her husband to a mining accident 4 years back, and had since made herself useful to Caldwell Hollow, in the way that widows sometimes did, quietly, reliably in the margins of other people's concerns. She cleaned the church on Thursdays. She cleaned Silas Drummond's office on Saturdays. She came on foot. She did not stop at the cabin door. She walked directly around to where Edith was working and stood a few feet away and spoke without preamble. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to understand that I am telling you because it's right, not because I am not afraid." Edith stopped working. She looked at Willa. "The land you're standing on," Willa said. "This parcel, the old Marin place." "Yes, Silas Drummond has it on a list." Willa kept her voice low and even. "A list of properties he's been moving toward acquiring. He's been building toward it for years. Small parcels, abandoned claims, anything without clear current ownership." She paused. "He knew about your family's situation before your parents were in the ground, Miss Voss, and he moved on it faster than was decent." Edith stood very still. "He moved you here," Willa said. "He didn't send you somewhere safe. He sent you to a place he was planning to take. If you fail, if you leave, it becomes available. And he'll have the papers for it inside of a month." The wind moved through the pines above them. Edith thought about the papers Drummond had brought to her door. How clean they were. How prepared. "He planned this," she said. "He plans everything," Willa said. "That's what he does. He makes the conditions and then he waits for the conditions to do the work. Edith looked down at the ground beneath her feet, the ground that someone had farmed once, that someone had built a cellar in, that the pines were taking back slowly and without malice in the absence of human intention. Well, she was here now, and she intended to stay. "Thank you," she said to Willa. Willa nodded once, and then she walked back the way she had come, her shoes quiet on the dry path, not looking back. Owen appeared at the corner of the cabin. He had heard. He looked at Edith with an expression that was doing a great deal of work trying to contain several large feelings in a face that was still in many ways a child's face. "So we can't leave even if we wanted to," he said. "We could leave," Edith said. "We could always leave. But then he gets what he was planning to get from the beginning." She looked at her brother. "How do you feel about that?" Owen thought about it. "I feel like I want to dig," he said. So they dug. What followed was the hardest work Edith had ever done in her life, and she had not before this considered herself a stranger to hard work. She had kept a house and a kitchen and helped with the harvest every fall and nursed 2 dying people and buried them and gone on. She knew hard work. This was different. This was the kind of labor that remade you from the outside in, the kind that started with your hands and worked its way through your arms and into your shoulders and down into your back until your whole body was something different than it had been before, harder, stranger, more itself somehow, as if the work were excavating not just the earth, but the person doing the excavating. They went 4 feet deeper than the original floor. 4 feet of dense blue clay subsoil, heavy and resistant, that came out in great dark chunks and had to be carried up and away a shovelful at a time. Owen worked beside her. His young back ached. She could see it in the way he moved by evening, the slight forward lean, the careful way he lowered himself to sit. He did not complain. He was becoming day by day someone she recognized from her father's description of what a good man looked like. Not someone without pain, but someone who did not let pain become the thing that decided. She spent 2 weeks walking the creek. This surprised Owen the first time. They needed stone. She had explained that. But he had assumed she would simply take the stone nearest to hand the fieldstone that lay scattered across the slope in convenient proximity, the same stone Thomas Marin had used. She explained why that was wrong. She did it the way her father had done it, not as a lecture, but as a walk. She took him to the creek and crouched at the water's edge and began picking up stones and handing them to him one at a time. "This one," she said. "Granite. Feel the density. That's weight, Owen. That's the stone holding on to something, cold in this case. The creek put that cold into the granite over years. We use this for the floor. This one. A flatter piece, lighter colored. Schist. Run your thumb along it." He did. "It feels almost soft. It's porous. It moves moisture in and out. We use this for the upper walls. The floor holds cold and the upper walls manage the moisture, and between them they create the conditions. For the cheese. For the cheese." She built the walls slowly. No mortar. Her father had been adamant about mortar. Mortar cracked, mortar failed. Mortar was the builder's way of admitting they didn't understand how the stones actually needed to sit. The dry stack method meant each stone had to be selected and placed so that its weight was balanced. Its angles interlocked, its relationship with its neighbors built on friction and gravity rather than adhesion. It was slow. It was right. She built the ventilation shafts near the top 2 of them, angled to prevent rain entry, one to draw cool night air in, and one to allow warmer interior air to exhale. She lined them with fitted smaller stones, and thought about her father saying, "A cellar must breathe, but not gasp." She built the roof of pine logs, covered them with oilcloth, covered that with packed clay, covered that with the excavated earth itself, seeded with grass. When it was done, the only visible sign from outside was a low grassy mound with a small stout wooden door set into its face. It looked like nothing. That was exactly right. Owen stood back and looked at it. "It looks like a hobbit lives here," he said. Edith did not know what a hobbit was. She assumed it was something from one of the novels he had been reading before their world changed. She did not ask. "Go inside," she said. He opened the door and ducked through. She waited. There was a long silence. Then, "It's cold." "Yes." Another pause. "And it smells different. Like the earth, but deeper, older." "Yes." He came back out and stood in the afternoon sun and blinked. "It works," he said. Not as a question, as a conclusion. And Edith, for the first time in a very long time, allowed herself the small private luxury of agreeing. The summer of 1886 was the kind of summer that made you believe in things. Not in the soft, vague way that people believe in things when life is easy, but in the hard, specific way. The way you believe in a nail when you are driving it into oak. The way you believe in fire when you are cold. Edith believed in stone. She believed in it the way her father had taught her to believe in it, not as faith but as knowledge. Which was better? Faith could be shaken. Knowledge could only be disproven. And the stone was not disproving anything. The cellar was finished by late July. She stood inside it on the day she declared it done, and held a candle up and turned in a slow circle, and looked at the walls she had built. The granite floor was laid tight and flat, each piece fitted against its neighbors so closely that a knife blade could not find the gap. The schist walls rose in careful courses, each stone locked against the next, without mortar, held by nothing but its own weight, and the weight of everything above it, and the precise understanding of how those two forces needed to be balanced. The ventilation shafts angled upward at the corners, two dark, narrow throats that breathed slow and cool in the August heat. The air inside was different from the air outside. Not just cooler. Different in quality. Heavier. Older. The way air feels inside a church that has been standing for 100 years, like the space itself has absorbed something from all the time that has passed through it. Her father would have approved. She was almost certain of that. Almost. Because there was always the question of almost. There was always the gap between knowing the principle and knowing that your application of the principle had been correct. Her father had built cellars. She had watched him build them. She had learned from the watching and the listening and the feeling of stone under her hands. But she had never built one herself. Until now. She blew out the candle and stood in the dark for a moment, just breathing. Then she went back to work. The cheese came next. She had been milking Nell twice a day since spring, and the grass had done what she'd predicted. As the valley greened up and Nell had more to eat, the milk came in fuller and richer cream, rising thick to the top of the bucket each morning. She had been saving, skimming, building toward this. She made the cheese in the large copper pot her mother had brought from Pennsylvania, a heavy, deep-sided thing that had made the journey west, packed in straw, and had arrived without a scratch. It was the finest object they owned. It was also at this point the only object they owned that could be described as fine. She heated the milk slowly, watching the temperature with the attention of someone who understood that patience was not a virtue in this context but a technical requirement. Too hot and the curds would be wrong. Too cool and the rennet wouldn't set properly. There was a temperature, a narrow, specific temperature, where the milk became something it hadn't been before, where it crossed a threshold. She had learned to feel that threshold with her hand. Owen watched from the doorway the first time. "What's the smell?" "Milk warming." "It smells like something's happening." "Something is." He came inside, sat at the table, watched with the focused attention he brought to things he didn't understand but suspected were important. She added the rennet, set the pot aside, covered it. "Now we wait," she said. "For how long?" "Until it's ready." Owen considered this answer, found it insufficient, did not say so. The curds formed overnight. She cut them in the morning slowly in long, careful strokes that released the whey in clean green-yellow streams. She heated them again, slowly stirring with a wooden paddle her father had made, pressing and folding until the curds were firm and dry and had lost most of what they didn't need. She pressed them into the wooden mold, salted the top, set them on the high shelf in the cabin to dry, and started again the next day. By the time the first frost came to Caldwell Hollow, a thin, delicate frost, barely a suggestion more warning than arrival, she had 6 wheels of cheese. They sat on the shelf in a row, pale yellow, firm, each one representing a week of milk and hours of work and a small, careful act of faith in a principle she had never tested at this scale before. She picked the best one up, held it. It was heavier than it looked, dense. The rind had started to form a thin outer skin that was beginning to darken at the edges. She set it back. "Tomorrow," she said. Owen looked up from where he was mending a piece of harness by the fire. "Tomorrow what?" "Tomorrow we move them to the cellar." He was quiet for a moment. And then we wait." He looked at the 6 wheels of cheese on the shelf. He had helped with all of them in one way or another, hauling water, feeding the fire under the pot, scrubbing the copper clean between batches with the particular thoroughness he brought to tasks he understood to be important. "How long?" "6 months, she said. "Maybe a little more." Owen processed this. "So we won't know until April." "No." He looked at the fire. "That's a long time to not know." "Yes," Edith said. "It is." The day they moved the cheese to the cellar was quiet and gray, a November sky pressing low over the valley, the pines standing dark and still against it. They carried the wheels one at a time, Edith going first with a lantern, Owen following with it, each wheel held carefully in both hands, moving with the deliberate carefulness of someone carrying something that cannot be replaced. Inside, Edith had built wooden shelves along the east wall. 3 shelves spaced a foot apart, each one supported by pegs she had mortised into the stone with a hand drill and a patience she would not have believed she possessed 6 months ago. She placed each wheel on the shelf with space between them. Let them breathe. She ran her hand along the stone wall. It was cool, slightly damp, exactly as she had intended. She took a long breath. Then she and Owen climbed back up the stone steps, and she pulled the heavy insulated door closed behind them. The sound it made was dull and final, a thud, like a period at the end of a sentence. They stood outside in the cold for a moment. "That's it," Owen said. "That's it." He looked at the grassy mound, at the small door, at the nothing that was visible of everything she had built. "It doesn't look like much from out here." "No," Edith agreed. "It doesn't." They walked back to the cabin. Winter arrived not as a guest, but as an occupation. It came down from the mountains with the efficient brutality of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years, and had no interest in your opinion of it. The temperature dropped, stayed down. The creek froze at the edges and then further and further in until only a thin dark line remained in the middle, moving fast and cold and indifferent. Snow came, stayed. The world outside the cabin reduced itself to a white silence, broken only by wind. Their days had a rhythm now, a simple repeating rhythm. Wake before light. Feed Nell. Carry water. Chop wood. Cook. Mend. Read when the light was good enough. Sleep. Once a week, Edith shoveled a path to the cellar door. This was not a small task. The snow came up over her knees in the worst weeks. She shoveled slowly and steadily, the way her father had taught her to approach any sustained physical effort, not fast, not slow, but consistent, the kind of pace you could maintain for hours without burning out. She opened the door, descended, checked each wheel, turned them, wiped the rinds with a brine-dampened cloth, checked for the kinds of mold that shouldn't be there, noted the ones that were exactly as they should be, climbed back up, closed the door, walked back to the cabin. Owen watched her do this every week. He never asked to come. She never offered. It was understood between them, without either of them articulating it, that the cellar was a thing Edith needed to do alone, the way some things are private, not because they are shameful, but because they carry too much weight to be shared while they are still unresolved. December passed, and then January came. January in the Colorado foothills in 1887 was the kind of cold that has intentions. It was not the cold of a winter that is merely passing through. It was the cold of a winter that has decided to stay, that has made itself comfortable, that has arranged all of its belongings in the space where warmth used to be and shows no signs of considering other options. The woodpile was going faster than Edith had calculated. She had calculated well, she thought. She had spent all of October cutting and stacking, calculating against a reasonable winter. A normal winter, the kind of winter that arrived and departed on schedule and didn't make itself a problem. This was not that winter. She recalculated. They would need more wood, which meant she would need to spend days cutting instead of mending or reading or resting, which meant Owen would need to do more of the daily tasks, which meant the days got harder and longer and the evenings got quieter, in the way that exhausted evenings always did not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet, the silence of people who have used up their words. It was on an afternoon in the third week of January that Owen disappeared, not in a frightening way, not in the way of a child lost in a blizzard. He had walked out after the morning chores and said he was going to check the south fence line, which had been sagging, and Edith had nodded and gone back to the woodpile and hadn't thought much about it until the light started going gold and low and he still wasn't back. She stood at the cabin door and looked south. The path to the Pruitt farm ran south. She knew that. She pulled on her coat. The walk to the Pruitt farm was 20 minutes in good weather. In the snow it was longer. And by the time she reached the edge of the Pruitt property, she was breathing hard and her feet were cold. She heard Owen's voice before she saw him. He was in the barn. She stopped outside the barn door. She did not go in immediately, because she could hear along with Owen's voice the low, deliberate voice of Harlan Pruitt. And the tone of that voice was the tone of a man making an argument he has thought about carefully. Structured. Reasonable. The kind of argument that is hardest to counter, not because it is clever, but because it genuinely comes from care. She stood in the cold and listened. Just for the winter, Harlan was saying, your sister could come too if she'd have it. There's room. The boy before you, he learned the trade in 3 years, was journeyman by 16. You've got good hands, I can see that. Owen's voice quieter. She won't leave. She might if you asked her. A pause. She won't. Then come yourself. You can still see her. It's 20 minutes. Another pause, this one longer. And in that pause, Edith heard something she had not expected to hear. Not agreement exactly, but the sound of a 12-year-old boy sitting with a temptation that made complete sense for a 12-year-old boy to feel. Warmth. Security. A trade to learn. A future with legible edges. All the things she could not give him right now. She pushed the barn door open. Both of them turned. Harlan had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Owen had the decency to look her directly in the face, which told her everything she needed to know about where he actually stood. He hadn't decided yet, but he had been close. Miss Voss, Harlan said. I heard, she said. She looked at Owen. He looked back, and then something happened that she had not anticipated, that she was not prepared for. Because she had been so focused on the work in the cellar and the principle and the stone that she had not left enough room in her attention for this. Owen said, You don't actually know it's going to work. The barn was very quiet. You think it will, he said. You're almost sure, but you don't know. And you're making us both wait through the worst winter in years for something that might not. He stopped. Not because he'd finished. Because he'd hit the edge of something. So, Owen, she said, you learned from Father. Father never built one of these. You learned the theory. You've never done it. She did not say anything, because he was right. That was the worst of it. He was right in the specific technical way that mattered. She knew the principles. She had applied them as carefully as she knew how. But she had never built a cheese cellar before. Thomas Marin had known something too, not as much, not the right things, but something, and his cellar had failed, and his cheese had died and turned to stone. She had not told Owen about Thomas Marin. She should have. You're guessing, Owen said. A very educated guess, but still, Harlan had the wisdom to be entirely silent. Edith looked at her brother. At the 12-year-old face that had her father's eyes and her mother's jaw, and the particular expression that appeared on it when he had decided to say something true, even though he knew it might cause damage. He had always been like that, even as a small child. She had loved that about him. She loved it right now, even though it felt like standing too close to something very hot. "You're right," she said. Owen blinked. "I'm guessing, a very educated guess like you said, based on principles that are sound and on work that I've done as carefully as I know how." She held his gaze. "But I don't have proof yet." "You're correct. I don't have it." He waited. "I'm asking you to stay anyway," she said. "Not because I can promise it'll work, but because leaving now because Drummond wins what he planned to win from the beginning. And because I believe it will work. And because Father believed in it too." She paused. "You can choose, Owen. I'm not going to make you." The barn was quiet for a long time. Then Owen looked at the floor, looked at Harlan Pruitt, looked back at his sister. "Fine," he said. And then, because he was 12 and had his dignity, "But if the cheese is bad in April, I'm learning carpentry." Something released in Edith's chest that she had not known was clenched. They walked home through the snow without talking. It was all right. Some things do not need to be talked about right after they happen. They need to be walked through instead. February was worse than January. It was not worse in temperature exactly, but in weight. January's cold had been sharp and bright, the kind that hurt clearly and specifically. February's cold was duller and heavier, a cold that pressed down instead of cutting, and a cold that made the world feel smaller. The woodpile was lower than she wanted it. Nell had stopped gaining weight and had begun to lose it slowly, the way animals do in long winters, when the hay runs short and there is nothing to be done about it but to ration carefully and hope the spring comes before the animal's reserves run out. Edith rationed, and she hoped. And on the 14th morning of February, she shoveled her weekly path to the cellar door. She went down. She held the lantern up. She saw the wheels of cheese on the shelf, and she stopped. 2 of the 6 wheels had mold on them. Not the fine grayish bloom she was expecting. Not the correct mold, the one that was supposed to be there, the one her father had described as the sign of proper aging. This was different. Dark. Almost black. Spreading across the surface of the rind in irregular patches. She stood very still. Her heart was doing something complicated. Because this was the thing she did not know. This was the exact edge of her knowledge. She knew granite. She knew schist. She knew temperature and humidity and ventilation and the proper culture for curd and the proper salt ratio and the proper pressing time. She did not know with certainty what this mold meant. Her father had talked about mold. Of course he had. Mold was inseparable from the cheese aging process. But the specifics were where memory became uncertain. She had been a child when he talked about it. She had been listening, but she had not been listening with the specific attention of a person who would one day need to know this exact thing in this exact situation. She moved closer, held the lantern and very near. The mold was dark. That was bad. She knew that thick black mold was wrong. She knew it could ruin a wheel from the inside out, moving through the paste in invisible threads before announcing itself on the surface. But she leaned closer still. The mold was thin, not thick, not deep, not the velvety heavy growth of something established and advancing. This was fine, almost surface only. Barely a film. She thought about her father. Tried to hear him. Gray is a friend. Thick black is the enemy. What had he said about thin black? She closed her eyes. Thin black on damp stone. She opened them. She looked at the stone wall directly beside the affected wheels. It was damp. More than usual. There had been a week of temperature fluctuation. She had felt it even from the outside, the days swinging warmer than expected, and then dropping again hard. The cellar would have felt that. It would have worked to compensate, but it would have taken time, and in that time the moisture levels would have risen. Thin black on damp stone. That is the cellar breathing. Was that right? Was she remembering correctly? Or was she remembering what she needed to remember because the alternative was too terrible to consider? She did not know. She stood in the cold lantern light and looked at the 2 wheels and felt the full weight of what she was facing. There was no one to ask. Her father was gone. There was no book. There was no neighbor with the knowledge. There was only her and the stone and the mold, and a decision she would have to make with incomplete information and live with either way. She thought about Thomas Marin. He had given up, or something had made him give up, or the conditions had been wrong from the start. And there was never a decision to make. It was just failure, slow and inevitable, working itself out. But her conditions were not his conditions. Her stone was not his stone. Her understanding was not his understanding. Thin black on damp stone. That is the cellar breathing. She made a decision. She did not touch the wheels. She did not intervene. She adjusted the ventilation, opened the north shaft slightly more than she had it set to increase the airflow to help the moisture move. She did this carefully with the small fitted stone she had designed for exactly this purpose, shifting at a fraction of an inch. Then she climbed back up the steps, closed the door, stood outside in the February air, and looked at the grassy mound, and thought, I have done what I can do. Now I wait. That night was the longest night. She lay in the dark and listened to Owen breathe from his cot on the other side of the room, and stared at the ceiling, and let her mind go through it again and again. The mold, the memory, the decision, the mold, the memory, the decision. At some point she stopped trying to think and just lay there. She thought about her father's hands, the way they looked when he was working square and capable, and moving with the calm assurance of a person who trusted what they knew. She thought about the creek in the afternoon, the weight of granite, the almost softness of schist. The stone remembers, he had said. She had to trust that it did. Morning came, and with it a knock at the door. It was Willa Ashby. She was standing in the February cold with her coat buttoned to the chin, and a small wooden box in her hands, and an expression on her face that was doing something complicated, trying to be calm and not quite managing it. May I come in? She said. Edith stepped back from the door. Willa came inside. She set the wooden box on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Edith. I have been keeping something, Sal, she said, that belongs to you. And I have been keeping it for 6 months. And I need you to understand that I kept it because I was afraid, and that the fear was not unreasonable, and that I am sorry it took me this long. Edith looked at the box. What is it? Willa opened the lid. Inside, folded carefully, were papers, pages, covered in a small, precise handwriting that Edith recognized from 7 feet away from across the cabin, without being able to read a single word. Her father's handwriting. She crossed the room in 3 steps. She picked up the top page with hands that were not entirely steady. It was her father's handwriting. Unmistakably, absolutely his, the way he made his lowercase e's and the slight leftward lean of his capital letters, and the habit he had of underlining things he considered particularly important. Diagrams, measurements, notes in the margin, observations about temperature and stone and aging and the particular behavior of different varieties of mold, everything. Everything he had known. Written down. Where did you find these? Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Silas Drummond's office, Willa said. In a locked drawer in his desk. I have a key to the office, but not to the desk. I found these because the drawer was not fully closed one morning in August. I could see the corner of a page. She paused. I recognized the handwriting. I had seen your father write. I knew. Edith was still looking at the pages. He took them, she said. He took the ledger, Willa said. These were inside the ledger. He took the ledger for the account numbers to support the false debt claim. These came with it. I don't think he knew what they were. To him, they were just pages. He put them in a drawer. The ledger. The proof that the debt was false, taken. Because without the ledger, there was no counter-argument. No way to dispute the clean, perfect, pre-planned paperwork Drummond had placed in Edith's hands 3 days after her parents were in the ground. He had thought of everything. Except Willa. Except a quiet woman with a key to his office who had seen the corner of a page in a drawer that wasn't quite closed. Edith sat down at the table. She spread the pages out in front of her. She read slowly. And as she read, she heard her father's voice, not as memory, not as imagination, but as something more immediate than either. As presence. As if the act of reading his words in his handwriting brought him back into the room in some way that was not nothing. He had written about mold. She found it on the 4th page. The mold question is the one most inexperienced builders get wrong, he had written. Visible mold on the surface of the rind is not inherently a sign of failure. The question is always what kind, how thick, and what the wall looks like behind it. A fine black film on a damp stone face adjacent to schist is almost always the cellar regulating moisture. It is the stone exhaling. Leave it. Adjust the ventilation slightly if you can. Check again in a week. She read it twice. Then she put her hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling. Leave it. Adjust the ventilation slightly. She had adjusted the ventilation. She had left it. She had done the right thing. Not by accident. Not by luck. Because her father had taught her with his voice and his hands. And now, from beyond the boundary, she couldn't cross with his written words. And she had listened well enough that even without the written proof, she had gotten it right. Owen had come to the table at some point during this. He had read over her shoulder in silence. When she finally looked up, he was sitting across from her. He did not apologize exactly. Owen was not the kind of person who apologized in direct sentences. He was the kind of person who showed it. He reached across the table and turned to the first page of the stack. In the top corner in her father's handwriting was one word. Her name. Edith. Just that. Owen pointed at it. Father wrote your name, he said. Yes. At the top, on the first page. Yes. Owen was quiet for a moment. He knew you'd be the one who needed this. Edith looked at the page, at her name in her father's hand. And the thing that happened in her chest then was too large to be called an emotion. It was more like a weather event. An interior weather event. Something that came in fast and moved through and left everything rearranged. She did not cry, she sat with it. The way you sit with things that are too important to rush through. Willa Ashby had stayed quiet in the corner by the window giving them this. Eventually Owen got up and put more wood on the fire. He did it with a care and a precision that was new. He had always done chores, but there was something different about the way he did this one, deliberate, attentive, like he was paying attention to the act itself rather than just the outcome. He stood up from the fire. Show me the ventilation shafts, he said. In the morning. Show me how you adjusted them. She looked at him. So I know, he said. In case you can't get there some week. In case you need me to check. This was not the apology. This was something better. She nodded. In the morning, so, she said. The fire settled. The wind moved outside, finding the gaps it always found, making its familiar sounds against the walls. And in the dark underground, in the cold, in the damp, in the slow, silent conversation between stone and earth and air that Edith had spent the better part of a year setting into motion, 6 wheels of cheese sat in the dark. 2 of them with a thin dark film on their rinds. Doing what they were supposed to do. Becoming what they were meant to be. Time doing its work. April came in quietly. Not with drama. Not with the kind of arrival that announces itself and expects applause. Just a slow, incremental softening of everything that had been hard for so long. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. Then the creek ice let go in the middle, the dark water moving again unhurried and sure of itself. The grass came back in the low places where the melt collected. Small. Tentative. The color of something that has been gone a long time and is not yet certain it is welcome. Edith noticed all of it. She had always noticed the land. But this April she noticed it differently. The way you notice things when you have been waiting for them. When the arrival of spring is not an abstract seasonal event but a specific personal answer to a specific personal question. 6 months. She had waited 6 months. And now the answer was behind that small wooden door set into the grassy mound behind the cabin. Waiting. Patient as stone. She did not go immediately. This surprised Owen, who had been watching her with the careful attention he'd developed over the winter, a watchfulness that was less like surveillance and more like the way you watch something you've decided to take care of. "It's April," he said on the morning of the third day. "Yes. It's been 6 months." "I know." He waited. "You're not going to go look." "I'm going to go look," she said. "Today." He waited some more. He was getting better at waiting. The winter had taught him that. "When today? When I'm ready." Owen considered this answer, found it more acceptable than he would have 6 months ago. "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "All right." The truth was she had almost gone the night before. She had lain in the dark listening to Owen sleep and thought it's ready. She knew it was ready. She could feel it the way you feel things you've been thinking about for a long time, not as intuition, which was too soft a word, but as accumulated knowledge expressing itself as certainty. But she had waited for morning, because some things should be done in the light. They walked out together in the early morning. The air was cold still, cold enough to see their breath. The kind of cold that April kept in reserve, not cruel but honest, a reminder that winter was not entirely gone, only retreating. The grassy mound looked exactly as it always had, which was the point. Owen stopped a few feet away. He crossed his arms. He did not say anything. Edith walked to the door. She put her hand on the wooden latch and stopped, because here it was, the moment, the one she had been building toward for the better part of a year, the one that would tell her whether her father's knowledge filtered through her imperfect memory, applied by her inexperienced hands held in the dark by stone she had chosen, and laid herself whether all of it had been enough or not. She breathed in. She pulled the door open. The air came out, not the stale, sour, collapsed smell of failure, not the dead air of a tomb. Something else. Something that hit her before she could think about it, cool and deep and layered, damp earth, cold granite. And underneath that, something complex. Something that had not been there 6 months ago when she closed the door. Something alive. Sharp and nutty and deep. The smell of transformation. The smell of time doing its work. She felt her eyes go hot. She did not cry. She descended the steps. The lantern was already lit. Owen had done it while she stood at the door without being asked, understanding that this was what was needed. He handed it to her. She took it. She went down. The shelves came into the light first. The wooden shelves she had pegged into the stone the previous summer, careful and deliberate, each peg mortised at the same height. And on the shelves, the 6 wheels, not pale yellow anymore. Not the raw, uncured things she had carried down here in November with hands that were trying not to shake. These were different. Transformed. They were golden. A deep amber gold like the afternoon light through old glass. The rinds had gone hard and mottled, covered in a fine grayish bloom, the exact bloom she had been hoping for, the one her father had described. The one that told you everything was right. She moved the lantern slowly, wheel by wheel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She got to the 6th wheel, one of the 2 that had shown the dark mold in February. And she stopped. The dark mold was gone. Not gone exactly. Incorporated. The rind had continued to develop over and around it. And what had looked in February like the beginning of a disaster was now simply part of the pattern, a slightly deeper area of color in the complex map of the rind's surface. The seller had corrected it. Just as the stone was supposed to. Just as her father had said it would. She stood there in the cold underground light for a long time. Longer than was strictly necessary for inspection purposes. She was having a conversation with her father that could not be conducted in words. Eventually, she reached out and took the smallest wheel from the shelf. Held it in both hands. It was heavier than it looked, dense, solid. The rind slightly rough against her palms. She climbed back up. Owen was standing where she had left him, arms still crossed, watching the door with an expression he was clearly working to keep neutral. She came out into the April morning with the wheel of cheese in her hands. He looked at it. He looked at her face. He read her face the way he had learned to read it over the winter, carefully, thoroughly, not missing much. And then something happened to his expression that he also tried to control and also could not entirely manage. A loosening, a release of something that had been held in tension for a very long time. "Well," he said. She looked down at the wheel in her hands, looked up at him. "Go get the knife," she said. He went. He came back in under a minute, which meant he had run, which he would never have admitted to. They sat at the cabin table in the thin April sunlight coming through the repaired south window. Edith set the wheel on the heavy wood. She positioned the knife. She pressed down. The rind was hard. It resisted. And then it yielded, not softly but firmly, the knife moving through it cleanly, the way good stone splits on a true line. The smell that came out was something she had never smelled in her life before. And also something she recognized completely. Her father's description. His exact words. From a summer afternoon in Pennsylvania when she was 8 years old, and sitting beside him while he described a cellar he had built for his own father, and the cheese that had come out of it, and the smell that had filled the room when they cut it. This smell. She pulled the wedge free. The interior was pale ivory, dense and smooth with a few small irregular openings, not holes exactly, more like pauses in the texture. The paste caught the light and held it. Perfect. She cut a thin slice, handed it to Owen. He ate it. She watched his face. He chewed slowly, his eyes closed. Not for show, she would have known. For real. The involuntary response of a person encountering something their body recognized as genuinely good. "It's sharp," he said. "Yes, and there's something else, underneath the sharp." "Nutty," she said. "That comes from the aging." He opened his eyes. "It tastes like something that took a long time." She looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "It does." She cut a piece for herself. The flavor arrived in stages. First the sharpness, clean and direct. Then the depth beneath it, layered and complex, the taste of milk transformed by time and cold and the slow breathing of the stone. And at the very end a long finish that lingered, savory and rich and somehow familiar. Her father's cellar. Her father's homeland. A taste she had never tasted before and had been waiting for her entire life. She set the knife down. She sat with it. The sunlight moved across the table. Owen let her sit with it. He was 13 now. He had become, over the course of this winter, something that was no longer quite a child, and not yet quite a man. Something in between, something that had the seriousness of the first and the beginning of the patience of the second. He cut himself another slice. She did not comment on this. She wrapped the remaining portion of the wheel in clean cloth. And she stood up. Owen looked at her. "Where are you going?" "Silas Drummond's office," she said. He stared at her. "Now?" "No." "With?" He looked at the wrapped cheese. "With that?" "Yes." "And Willa's coming." "I sent word yesterday." Owen processed this, realized she had been planning this for longer than this morning, possibly for several days, possibly for the entire winter. "You were ready before today," he said. "I needed to be sure of the cheese first." He was quiet. "Can I come?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "But you don't say anything." "I won't say anything." "Owen?" "I won't say a word." She looked at him for another moment. "Get your coat, she said. Willa Ashby was waiting at the edge of the Pruitt Road. She was wearing her good coat, her good shoes, her hat from church. She had the small wooden box under her arm, the box with the papers inside. Her father's papers. She looked at Edith. Edith looked at her. "Ready," Edith said. "I have been ready," Willa said, "for considerably longer than you know." They walked into Caldwell Hollow together. The three of them. A woman of 22, a boy of 13, and a widow of 45 who had been quietly carrying a piece of truth in a locked box for 6 months, and was done carrying it alone. The town was going about its mourning. People noticed them. Of course they noticed. Because people in small towns always notice the things that are slightly different from what they expected. And Edith Voss walking into town with her brother and Willa Ashby, and a cloth-wrapped package, and a particular expression on her face, was slightly different from anything anyone in Caldwell Hollow had expected from this direction. Edith did not stop to speak to anyone. She went directly to the office. Silas Drummond was at his desk. He looked up when the door opened. He had the expression of a man accustomed to controlling the conditions of every room he entered with slight readiness, a slight shaping of the face toward authority, a posture that said, "I know how this works and you don't." He looked at Edith. He looked at Willa. Something moved behind his eyes. Very fast. Very controlled. The way a careful man processes an unexpected situation rapidly, privately, without letting it reach the surface. He stood up. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mrs. Ashby, this is—" "Please sit down," Edith said. He paused. That was interesting. That small pause. The pause of a man encountering a register of authority from a direction he had not anticipated. He sat. Edith set the cloth-wrapped cheese on the corner of his desk. She unwrapped it. She said nothing. Drummond looked at the cheese, at the wedge already cut from the wheel, at the pale ivory interior and the golden rind, and the evidence of 6 months of proper aging. He said nothing either. Willa placed the wooden box on the desk, opened it, set the papers on the desk surface one at a time deliberately, the way you set out evidence. Because that was what they were. "My father's papers," Edith said. "Found in the locked drawer of your desk." Drummond's eyes moved to Willa. "I don't know how—" "The drawer wasn't fully closed one morning," Willa said. Her voice was even, steady, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this in her head for a long time. "I saw the edge of a page. I recognized the handwriting." Silence. "These papers were inside my father's ledger," Edith said. The ledger that documented every transaction and every tax payment, every financial record of his estate. The ledger that proved there was no debt. She looked at Drummond. "The ledger you took from our home. That's a serious—" "Yes," she said. "It is." She let that sit. She was not angry. This surprised her slightly. She had expected anger. But what she felt instead was something quieter and more solid. Certainty. The same quality of certainty she had felt when she looked at the rinds of those 6 wheels of cheese in the lamplight this morning. She had done the work. The work was done. This was just the final step. "The land office in Denver keeps records," she said. "Independent records. My father paid his taxes. That record exists somewhere he could not reach." She paused. "And the town council is made up of men who may be many things, but who I believe would not choose to be publicly associated with the fraudulent seizure of an orphaned girl's land." Drummond looked at the papers, at the cheese, at Willa, at Owen, who was standing by the door saying absolutely nothing and doing it with a remarkable intensity, at Edith. The thing about a man like Silas Drummond was that he was at his core a calculator. He had not done what he did from passion or cruelty. He had done it from calculation. He had calculated that 2 orphaned children without resources or connections would be an insufficient force to oppose whatever position he chose to take. He had not calculated for this. He had not calculated for a girl who spent the better part of a year building something he couldn't touch. He had not calculated for Willa Ashby and her access to his office and her 6 months of quiet courage. He had not calculated for a boy who stood in a doorway and said nothing, and somehow made saying nothing feel like a wall. He recalculated. "The matter of the Voss property on the North Road," he said carefully, "may have been handled incorrectly, due to clerical error." He paused. "I will have it reviewed." "You'll have it corrected," Edith said. Another pause. "Corrected," he said. "Within the week." He looked at her. She looked all back. She picked up the wrapped cheese from the corner of his desk. She picked up her father's papers one by one and placed them back in Willa's box. "Good morning, Mr. Drummond," she said, and she walked out. Owen got the door. Because of course he did. They stood outside in the April morning, the three of them. Willa let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the previous August. Owen looked at Edith with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was also fairly obviously impressed. "You didn't raise your voice?" he said. "No." "You didn't threaten him?" "No." "You didn't even—" He paused. "You just put the cheese on his desk." "Yes." Owen thought about this. "That was the threat," he said. Edith allowed herself something that was almost a smile. "The cheese was not a threat," she said. "The cheese was proof. The papers were the threat." Owen considered this distinction. "Right," he said. They walked from Drummond's office to the Pruitt farm. It was a 20-minute walk in good weather. The weather was good. April was tentative but cooperative. The sun doing its best, the mud on the road beginning to firm at the edges. Edith carried the cheese. She did not think about what she would say, because she did not have a great deal to say. Harlan Pruitt was in his barn. Of course he was. He was always in his barn in the morning. He had been always in his barn in the morning for 30 years. And he would be always in his barn in the morning for however many years he had left, because some people are like that. They organize their lives around a reliable point and then stay near it. He looked up when she came in. Mabel was behind her. Mabel had come out of the house the moment she saw them coming up the road, the way a person comes out of a house when they have been watching a road for a very long time without knowing they were watching it. Harlan set down the harness he was working on. He looked at Edith. She unwrapped the cheese. She set it on the workbench beside him. He looked at it for a long moment, at the rind, at the cut face. He said nothing. He took the small knife from his belt. He cut a piece. He put it in his mouth. And then he was quiet for a very long time, chewing, looking at something in the middle distance that was not in the barn at all. Something further away than that. Mabel had come to stand beside him. He handed her a piece without looking. She ate it, and her eyes went wide, wide and bright, the way eyes go when something lands that they were not expecting. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something emphatic in the pine tree beside the fence. Harlan Pruitt looked down at the cheese in his hand. He looked at Edith, and on his face was something she had never seen there before. Not pity, not skepticism, not the patient sorrow of a man watching someone make a mistake he was too polite to fully articulate. Something else. Recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has spent their life trusting their own experience and has just encountered evidence that their experience was not the whole picture. He cleared his throat. "I'll be," he said, quiet, almost a whisper. "I was wrong." 3 words. That was all. But the weight of them, the specific gravity of a man like Harlan Pruitt saying those 3 words, it was not a small thing. It was not the easy, frictionless admission of someone who holds their opinions loosely. He held his opinions with both hands. He always had. Letting go of this one cost him something. Edith could see it. She did not press. She did not underline. She did not add anything to those 3 words because they did not need anything added to them. She nodded. Mabel stepped forward. She put her hands around Edith's hands. Both of them. The warm, dry hands of a woman who had spent 52 years doing things with them and knew what they were for. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. But her eyes said, "I see you. I saw you from the beginning, even when I didn't understand. Even when I couldn't follow. I see what you did." And that was its own kind of thing. The days that followed were strange and good. Strange because Caldwell Hollow did not change overnight. It never does. Towns don't. People don't. The knowledge of what Edith had done moved through the community the way her father had said the schist moved moisture. Not in a rush, not all at once, but steadily finding its way through the available passages absorbed. Where it could be absorbed. It began with Willa Ashby. She came to the homestead on a Tuesday morning with her coat on and her sleeves already rolled up. "Show me," she said. "What specifically?" "All of it. Start at the creek." So Edith took her to the creek. and crouched at the water's edge and picked up a piece of granite. "Feel the weight, though," she said. Willa felt it. "Now this one." She handed her a piece of schist. Willa ran her thumb along the surface, looked up. "It feels different." "It is different. Completely different material. Completely different purpose." Willa looked at the creek, at all the stones in it, at the variety of them, the size and color and texture of them, the whole quiet library of the creek bed that she had walked past for years without reading. "I've walked this creek my whole life," she said. "Most people have. I never thought it was different. One stone from another. Most people don't." Willa was quiet. "That's the knowledge," she said. "That's what your father gave you, not just the technique, the way of looking." Edith looked at her, because that was exactly it. That was the thing she had been trying to articulate to herself for months, the thing she had felt but not put words to. The knowledge was not a recipe. It was a way of seeing. It was the difference between looking at a creek and seeing gravel, and looking at a creek and reading a library. Her father had given her that. And now she was giving it to Willa. And Willa, she already understood, would give it to someone else. That was how it worked. That was the only way it could work. Mabel Pruitt came the following week. She sat at Edith's table and tasted the cheese and asked questions in the careful, methodical way she asked questions about things she genuinely wanted to understand. She took notes. She had brought a small notebook and a pencil, and she was not embarrassed about using them. She learned to make the cheese. She was good at it. Not immediately. Not without errors. But with a persistence that Edith recognized, the same persistence that had gotten her through a Colorado winter with 6 wheels of cheese in the dark and a brother who had almost given up. 2 other women from Caldwell Hollow came before May was out, then a third. Then a man, Will Courtney, who had heard from his wife and come himself to understand the cellar design because he wanted to build one for storing apples through the winter. Edith showed him the stone. She showed him the depth, the ventilation, the reason for each choice. He listened. He had the face of a man listening to something being taught who is realizing partway through that the thing being taught is more interesting than he expected. "Who taught you this?" he asked. "My father. He was a mason." "He was." Will Courtney looked at the cellar. "He was a good one, Kiddo," he said. "Yes," Edith said. "He was." The season turned. Summer came, and with it the work of the second year. A larger garden, more milk, more cheese. The first wheels from the new season went into the cellar in the fall, alongside the last 2 wheels from the previous batch, which had been traded for seed corn and a good saw, and 3 months of flour in the spring. The homestead was changing, not dramatically, not overnight, but with the same quality of change that the cellar operated by, slow, steady in one direction, each day slightly further along than the last. Edith and Owen built a proper door for the cabin that winter, and in the spring they started on the barn. It was not a large barn, but it was a good one, built with the same attention to material and structure that Edith brought to everything now. Each log chosen, each joint fitted with care. Owen did much of the work. He had grown through the winter, not just in height, which was considerable, but in the quality of his attention. He worked the way Edith worked, slowly, deliberately, with the particular patience of someone who has learned at a foundational level that the process is not the obstacle to the outcome. The process is the outcome. She had not taught him that directly. She had just done it, in front of him, for a year and a half, and he had learned it the way she had learned things from her father. Sideways, through the hands, in the middle of something else. It was a September evening, the 2nd September. They were sitting by the fire after supper. The light was going early now, the way it always did when September started meaning something. The fire was not necessary yet, but was pleasant. Owen looked up from the book he was reading. "Were you scared?" he said. Edith looked at him. "When?" "That winter, the whole winter. Were you actually scared that it wouldn't work?" She thought about this honestly. Not the answer she might have given to comfort him. The honest one. "Yes," she said. "When was it worst? In February," she said. "When I saw the dark mold." before I remembered what Father said about it. For about 30 seconds I was yes. I was frightened. Owen nodded. What made it stop the fear? She looked at the fire. I remembered his voice, she said. Not the words at first, just his voice, and then the words came. She paused. The stone remembers the cold, he used to say. The cheese remembers the stone. She was quiet for a moment. I thought if the stone can remember, so can I. Owen was quiet. He looked at the fire. Then he set his book down. I'm sorry, he said. For January. For what I said. You were right, she said. I was scared. I know. It made me want to find a reason it wouldn't work so I could leave first. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was 13. He was becoming something. She could see it happening in real time, the way you can see ice thawing in a river. Not the exact moment, but the direction, the ongoing, irreversible process of it. You stayed, she said. That's what matters. He nodded. Then he looked at his hands. Show me, he said. The ventilation system. All of it. I want to understand all of it. Not just which stone goes where. The why. She looked at him for a long moment. Because here it was. The thing her father had done for her. Now, in this room, with this boy, who was becoming a man who would carry something forward. She reached into her coat pocket. She had been carrying the first page of her father's notes since February. The page with her name at the top. She carried it the way some people carry a photograph, not to look at necessarily, but to know it was there. She took it out. She looked at it for a moment. Her name. Her father's handwriting. Then she held it out to Owen. He took it. He looked at it. Looked at her. Father wrote your name, he said. Yes. At the top. He wrote my name, she said, because he knew I'd need it first. Owen waited. And then pass it on. He looked down at the page. At his father's handwriting. At the careful diagrams. At the underlined words and the marginal notes. And the accumulated knowledge of a man who had understood stone the way other men understand music, not just the notes, but the silence between them. His hands were not quite steady. That was all right. Knowledge isn't meant to be kept, Owen, she said. It only lives when it moves. The fire settled. Outside, the first cool air of autumn was coming down from the mountains, finding its way through the valley, moving through the pines with the sound that pines make in the fall. A sound like something turning over. Like something beginning. Owen held the page for a long time. Then he folded it carefully. He put it in his own pocket. And in the morning they went to the creek. She showed him the granite, the schist, the weight, the texture, the difference. He closed his eyes without being asked, and she heard her father's voice, low and calm and present in the October air. Feel the weight of it. She stood beside her brother at the edge of the cold water and watched him turn a stone over in his hands. Slowly, carefully, with the focused, open attention of someone learning to read a new language. And the creek ran over the stones the way it always had, patient, purposeful, indifferent to everything but direction. Years passed. The homestead by the pines was no longer a ruin. It was a farm, a real one. Not large but thorough, the kind of place that had been thought about and worked on and cared for in a way that showed in every beam and every fence post and every row of the kitchen garden. The cellar was the heart of it, still standing, still working. Its stone walls doing what stone walls do when they have been well chosen and well laid, enduring. Temperature steady. Moisture balanced, the slow, silent conversation between earth and stone and air continuing without interruption, the way a good thing continues when it has been built correctly. Wheel after wheel of cheese came out of it over the years, traded, sold, given to neighbors who had learned to build their own cellars, their own versions, each one a variation on the same principle. The knowledge spread through Caldwell Hollow and then beyond it, the way water spreads through soil, not following a straight line, finding the paths that are available, going where it can go. Owen became a man. He married a woman named Ruth, who had come from Kansas and had her own opinions about things, and expressed them plainly, which Owen found so refreshing after years of people who softened everything that he loved her for it immediately. They had a daughter, Clara. She had her father's eyes and her grandmother's jaw, and an interest in everything that showed up before she could walk. She would sit in the dirt outside the cellar door and put her hands flat on the earth and look at the ground with an expression of complete concentration as if she were trying to hear something. Owen watched her do this one afternoon. She was 4 years old. He sat down beside her in the dirt. "What do you hear?" he asked. She looked up. "Nothing yet," she said. "But I think it says something." He took her hand. He led her down to the creek. He crouched at the edge of the water the way Edith had crouched beside him, the way their father had crouched beside Edith. And he picked up a stone from the creek bed, dense gray smooth from years in the current. He placed it in his daughter's small hands. "Feel the weight of it," he said. She felt it. "Close your eyes." She closed them. "That stone was in cold water for a long time," he said, his voice going low and quiet, the way you speak when you are passing something important and don't want to startle it. "It remembers the cold. You can feel it if you're paying attention." Clara was very still. Her small face was serious. Her eyes were closed. The creek moved around the stones the way it always had, cold and clear and indifferent to everything but its own direction. "I feel it," she whispered. Owen looked at his daughter's face, at the careful, focused attention of a child encountering a principle for the first time and beginning in some proverbial way to understand it. He thought about Edith, about a winter in 1886, about a grassy mound with a small wooden door, about 6 wheels of cheese in the dark becoming something that no one in Caldwell Hollow had ever tasted before, about a woman who had stood in front of that door one April morning with her hand on the latch. Not pulling, not pushing, just standing, and then pulling. He looked at his daughter. "Stone doesn't lie," he said. "People lie. Stone doesn't." Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the stone in her hands. She looked at the creek. She looked at her father. "Can we get more?" she said. Owen smiled. "Yes," he said. "How do you know which ones?" "I'll show you," he said. "It takes time to learn. But once you know how to look." He paused. He was hearing Edith's voice. He was hearing his father's voice behind that. "Once you know how to look, you never stop seeing it." Clara looked at the creek, at all the stones in it. She was 4 years old and she was already beginning to read. The cellar stood through that year and the next and the many years after that. Long after Edith was gone, laid to rest on the hill above the farm in a place that looked out over the valley and the creek and the line of pines against the foothills. Long after Owen's hair went gray and his hands grew stiff, and he passed the work to Ruth and to Clara, and stood back and watched with the satisfaction of a man who has contributed something real to the world and knows it. The cellar stood, in its cool stone silence, doing what it had always done, what the stone had always done, remembering.